Start the recording. Hey, y'all. It's good to see folks. Hey, Evan. Hey, Rema. Hey, Kathy. Emily, hi. Amanda, hi. It's good to see you. Augustus, Mark, Rebecca, Sir, Randy, hi. Zach, hi. Um, it's great to see folks. We'll let folks continue to trickle in, as I know they are wont to do. But go ahead and say hi in the chat, drop where you are, how you're doing, general check-in. I hope everyone's doing well. It's great to see folks. Um, I'm really, really excited that Max Kreminski's here with us today, and they're going to be showing us a little bit of a toolkit that they've developed, as well as long as some of their creative computational projects. But before then, quick introduction to me, and if you don't already know, I'm Carly Schnitzler. I use she, her pronouns, and with Liliana von Bertram and sort of our team of intrepid community advisory board, we've been running uh, this workshop series on creative computation for the last 5 years now, and we hold monthly workshops. Oh, hi from Ontario. I love Ontario, Amanda. Um, and yeah, and we hope this is a space that feels like you belong here, everyone belongs here, as long as you're a creative, kind, thoughtful, interested person, you're welcome here. And do what you need to do to take care of yourself, keep cameras on and off as you want to, get up, go to the bathroom, get a snack. Overall, just remember you're a person in a body, even though we're just little squares on Zoom to each other physically right now. But take care of yourself. And yeah, the chat is your space. Go ahead and jump in there. I hope, Kathy, you're staying warm in the snow. It's currently super gross and rainy in Baltimore right now. Um, but very excited to have you all here. Very excited to have Max here. Um, quick bio on Max, and I know that they're gonna talk a lot more about their work, but Max is a human computer interaction researcher trying to make computers better at supporting human creativity. Their primary focus is the design, development, and evaluation of AI-based creativity support tools to assist designers and artists. So you all. So far, they've mostly worked on tools for storytelling, poetry, and game design, as well as new domain general ways to assess tool impacts on creative practice. And their work has been covered by outlets like The New Yorker, New Scientist, and The Verge. So I'm really thrilled that Max is here with us today, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Max.
Awesome, thanks. And yeah, good to see everybody here. Some people that I recognize in the chat and so on. Yeah, so I think the way we're going to structure this is kind of as like a two-parter. At the first sort of half of it, I'm going to give a talk about some of my work, mostly focused on computational poetry, and sort of like weird machines for manipulating text in various ways using algorithms. And then for the second half, we'll do, I think, a little bit of questions or discussion, and then like kind of shift into live coding, where we work with a thing that I've been playing with is browser embeddings, basically. So like using text embeddings for short text strings. In the web browser to build like weird text manipulation machines that do kind of strange poetry things. Um, so I guess I'll just go ahead and jump right in. I think people can see slides. So yeah, talk's called Playing Around in Semantic Space. The playing part is kind of the idea of like textual instruments is intended to allude to, which we might get to a little bit. And then semantic space is kind of this broad space of possible texts, this universe of possible texts that exist. And so I'm going to kind of discuss how we might probe that universe and like sort of find different interesting points in it. A little bit of background about me. I'm going to be faculty in design tech at Cornell Tech in New York City coming pretty soon. That's going to be the middle of this year kind of range. In the meantime, I'm kind of hanging out at UC Berkeley as a visiting scholar there. Thank you. And yeah, before that, I was director of the storytelling lab at Midjourney, which is kind of this weird like hybrid industry but academic flavored research group that was mostly doing like open publications and building like weird experimental demos and that kind of thing. Um, and my research focus, as Carly mentioned, is in AI-based creativity support tools, which is to say, using technologies that are broadly considered AI or have been considered AI in the past. The meaning of that term has shifted a lot in the last couple of years, and so I think it used to apply to a much broader range of stuff. To build creativity support tools, which is to say, systems that are made of software and that you can use to do creative stuff. And in the particulars of that, like I do a lot of work on game design and interactive narrative on poetry, and creative practices where I personally have some investment or stake, because I've done a lot of work in those fields myself. And in practice, what this also means is that I'm active on both the AI and HCI, or human-computer interaction sides of creativity support research. So I tend to both build new models or algorithms on the AI side, but then also build really complicated new interfaces around them that are intended to expose them in different ways or make them, fun to work with or play with or manipulate. And my PhD was actually in computational media from UC Santa Cruz, and my graduate work there was focused on what we call technical games research. So I did a lot of work there on like AI-based tools for game design, interactive narrative AI, where you're maybe like simulating characters that you can like talk to or work with or interact with in games. And in general on playful forms of creativity. So creativity not as this thing where we were treating it as, oh, there's only a few people who can be creative, or like this virtuosic activity of like the Beethovens of the world or whatever, but much more personal creativity, small scale creativity, the thing that Kate Compton sometimes calls casual creators, where you do a lot of stuff that's creative in your day-to-day life that's relatively low stakes, but like fun to do or like more approachable forms of creativity sometimes. And yeah, as I mentioned, I've worked in AI-based tools for storytelling and game design and poetry, and I'm really going to be focused in this talk primarily on the poetry side of that. And more specifically, I think that at heart, I'm really a computational poet. Like, this is something I've kind of been realizing over the last couple of years, where I do a lot of poetry as like a normal, just like sit down and write a poem practice, but also a lot of the construction of machines that like manipulate language in poetic ways. And this computational poetry stuff is sort of like my personal artistic practice that like sort of keeps coming back over and over and over again. So I think it's the thing where a lot of my enthusiasm is right now. And for me, what this means is that you can kind of look at the universe of texts that might exist as a sort of like nested Venn diagram-y kind of thing. First off, there's the space of texts that I myself would sit down and write if I was just writing poetry myself organically. Maybe without like a sort of computer in the loop, or maybe I'm doing it with like, a word processor or something typical like that, where the words are all coming out of my head, basically. I'm just thinking of what words to write and writing them down. Then you've got this much larger universe of all of the texts that might exist, which is like kind of ridiculously broad. There's lots of different ways of sort of like arranging the letters in the English language, lots of different words that you can sort of like resort or like remanipulate, and you end up with this space of basically mostly nonsense. There's a lot of text out there that contains like very little meaning from a human perspective, but that is fully representable in various like writing systems or writing forms. And then, of course, there's this broader universe that kind of sits between these of compelling texts, in my opinion. So texts that I think I would think to write, that I would think to produce, tend to be things that I like or that I think are good. But then other human writers have also written things that I think are compelling. And for instance, machines sometimes might produce texts that I think are compelling. And these sit outside sometimes of the space of text that I would ever myself think to write, but within this much broader space of other things that might be nonsense. And then, of course, there's the overlapping space of text that others would write. So another human might sit down and write a bunch of stuff, and I might or might not like that thing that they write. So there's kind of this like overlapping space of things that are to my taste, that other people would think of that I wouldn't. But then we've also got the problem of texts that a machine could produce, and this is sort of an alternative subspace. Not necessarily any of the texts that others would write fall into the text that a particular sort of like computational poetry like generator would produce. But there's a lot of things that are also kind of like intersecting with this nonsense space, but also intersecting along the way with the texts that I think are compelling. And my focus right now is really on the stuff that kind of falls into this intersection here. So this sort of region, I'm like double advancing. Um, the sort of region where you've got this overlap between things that I would think to write unaided, or and things that a machine could produce on its own that are kind of nonsensical. But in the middle, this range of stuff that is compelling to me that I would never reach on my own without kind of using something to constrain or manipulate my perception of the space of language, basically. And so this is the kind of place where I'm really interested in making interventions. These kinds of like poetry machines that sort of operate in this narrow area. And this is connected quite strongly to what Alison Parrish, another famous computational poet, has called semantic space probes. She discusses in this talk exploring semantic space with literal robots. This idea of the space probe as a machine that we, as human beings, kind of construct on Earth and send out into this very vast void of the unknown. And the unknown in the literal sense is space, right? Like this kind of very inhospitable environment. It's very cold. There's no atmosphere up there. It's super, super huge. Traversing it takes a long time. And so we as explorers ourselves cannot go out into the void of space directly without either a whole lot of apparatus around us, or without some kind of proxy to go there on our behalf. But if we construct a little robot, like a space probe, we can send it out there. We can equip it with like sensors and stuff, and have it kind of explore this void of space and report back to us on Earth, remotely some data on like what it's finding, things that it's encountering as it sort of goes through this vast space of the universe. And by sending out this cute robot explorer into the unknown and sort of getting back signals from it, we can learn about things that we could not reach or traverse ourselves. Stuff that's in this kind of inhospitable semantic void or inhospitable literal void. And I think the space of nonsense is sort of similar. It's like this inhospitable semantic void that you as a human being don't necessarily want to spend much time traversing. If you just like iterate through all the different ways of arranging letters or all the different ways of arranging words, or other kinds of nonsense, you find that it gets like tiring very quickly. It's exhausting. It's something you don't want to spend a lot of time doing or like sort of thinking about. But if you can build a robot that can kind of go out into the nonsense for you and has some sort of detection ability to sort of notice interesting things and send back information about them, then the things it detects or finds might be these interesting discoveries that are only possible through this aid of like a probe that we're sending out into this vast nonsense void. And so I think about a lot of my work in this sort of frame or forming. Um, and I think it's really interesting that we think of being lost often as a bad thing in many different domains, but artists are often trying to get lost. On the right here, we have kind of a diagram of basically flânerie, this practice of, as a writer, kind of going out into the world and wandering and drifting around, and observing whatever it is you happen to see as you sort of like walk or sort of like traverse the city, with not really like a strong goal in mind, not necessarily even a strong sense of like where you are at any given point, but with this eye towards just getting inspired by things that you see in the world, like kind of happening into weird situations and noticing them. And I think one of the reasons that artists are often trying to get lost is in order to lose themselves. When you, as a human writer, have sort of a patterned idea of like what kinds of words you like to assemble and what kinds of orders, when you have this like body of sort of like references or tradition that's kind of like sitting on you and influencing everything that you write, when you have an audience maybe that's kind of shaping your the response that you get to the works that you put out into the world, then you can kind of get tired of your own output, I think, of the things that tend to come out of your head or out of your mouth or out of your pen when you try to sit down and write. And so this can be a little bit boring, I think, or a little bit frustrating to someone who's trying to get out into like the weird parts of language and like explore like experimental new forms of writing. And so I think getting lost becomes a way to lose yourself, to kind of get outside of your own preconceptions of how language should be arranged or how poems should be constructed or how stories should be written or whatever. And I think also we try to get lost in order to lose our pursuers. By pursuers, I kind of mean the machine of like cultural repetition, where when you put something out that's like really successful and fresh and experimental and new, and everyone likes it and responds to it really well, then almost immediately culture starts steering itself towards that thing, towards the production of more of that thing. It starts to become imitated. It starts to become like part of a style or a scene, and it starts to gradually become a little bit passé or a little bit like universal if people keep doubling down on it. And we end up with the thing that was super fresh and new, starting to feel a little bit staler or more ossified or kind of like locked in a way that it's harder to differentiate from the background noise of what everyone else is trying, basically. And I think when you get stuck in your own repertoire, you start having this feeling of, okay, well, the stuff that I'm writing is now mostly patterned by the stuff that I've written in the past. It's kind of like repeating myself or like restating the same themes or like reusing language that I don't find fresh anymore, even though it did maybe feel fresh in the first days. And then there's other people who are also kind of like adapting to the stuff that I've put out there and it becomes part of the cultural conversation or the scene. And you get kind of maybe stuck in a rut, basically. You start to feel like you're creatively like stuck. And so I think again, this practice of lostness is really important, or to kind of get out of the preconceptions of how language ought to be arranged, both that you have in your own head and that are out there in culture more broadly, maybe influenced by the things you put out there in the past if you're successful as like an influential writer. And so I think a lot of my practice is really about alternative ways of writing to try to help us get lost, to help us both sort of go out into that unknown of the nonsense space and find interesting things and report them back like a semantic space probe, but also to get us to a place that we wouldn't get to on our own, some place that we find ourselves maybe a little bit out of our depth, or a little bit confused, but also where we're finding things that are compelling and that are kind of like fresh and novel and help us feel like that our own work is interesting to us again. And there's four different strategies that I've employed in some of my recent projects that I'm calling broadly like textual sculpture. I don't think this is the only way to go about doing this, but it's some of the strategies that I've been employing. So I'm going to kind of like talk about these different moves that I make as sort of like examples. And one of these is going from accretion of like writing word by word by word, kind of appending words to the text as you go, or just like gradually starting from nothing and building up to something, toward erasure as a strategy for writing. So you start with a lot of text that already exists or has already come from some other source, and you sort of carve it away iteratively, to kind of arrive at things that are within it, maybe like sort of freeing the statue from the marble, as it were. Another strategy that I tend to employ is dictation, moving towards gesture. So dictation is kind of the writing as choice of words approach, where you kind of like manually pick out the words that you want to use to say the thing you want to say. Whereas I think when you have a sort of like interesting computational interface in the loop, you can start to do things that are non-textual in form, like literally waving around your hands, or otherwise sort of like using other modes than writing per se or speech per se, to arrive at words indirectly. So sort of like translating gestures or other things of that form into textual expressions. A third strategy that I tend to employ is moving from addition or the making of these one-off targeted textual changes, where you kind of like look at the text that you've written so far and try to find like individual things to tweak about it, toward mutation. Mutation is maybe not the best word for it, but the idea is that you can kind of warp lots of different words in the text at once. You can maybe apply a transformation to like every single word in the whole document you're writing, or maybe like nudge texts around in semantic space. Maybe say you have like a poem you've written and you want it to be like 10% closer to the idea of the ocean. And you can somehow sort of like push it along that vector to get like more oceanic. And then finally, the strategy of moving from integration or the stitching together of multiple different drafts that you've written manually, toward crossover or maybe interpolation between variants. And this is where we start to get to this interesting point of like texts themselves as anchor points or references in this vast textual space, and being able to kind of like draw a line between one text and another and like interpolate along that line, or possibly even like take the stylistic elements of one and the like syntactic elements of another and kind of like slot them together in a way that produces some new like weird variation or crossover. And I'll give a few examples of each of these just to kind of like walk you through some of these poetry machines that I built. Oh, it's important to note also that these are not necessarily better or worse strategies for writing. I think there's a lot of different ways you can approach the production of texts, and some of them are like differently interesting or legitimate or like part of different practices. These are ones that just happen to be compelling to me at this moment. Okay, so talking about erasure a little bit. This is kind of the first one where I started making serious contributions, and I did a lot of this stuff back in like 2019, where I was playing with blackout poetry specifically. Um, the system that I built at the end of the blackout poetry exploration was called called Redactionist, and it's kind of a tool for basically creating erasure poetry by interactively removing most of the words from a source text and choosing only a few to keep or retain, with whatever is left over at the end, sort of constituting the poem. I'm going to hop over to this other tab here for a second and just show you what this looks like. Here we have just kind of the default starter text for the system. This is a passage from Exploring Semantic Space with Little Robots, that Alison Parrish thing I mentioned earlier. Um, and this is sort of like an editable text area. So I can go ahead and like change things if I want, but I'm going to mostly leave it as is. And then when I hit this Pomify button, it's going to kind of look at all of the words in this passage. It's going to black everything out, just kind of like erase it, sort of like omit it, by sort of like placing a black mark on top of it. But some of the things that are left over are going to be highlighted in this kind of purple mark instead. And these are words that I could choose to include in sort of like a reduced, like refined down poem that kind of comes out of the source text. And so if I pick a word like right and I want to use right in it, then we can see that the space of possibilities for words that might come before and after that word gets locked down somewhat. Some of those words that were purple become black instead, so they're no longer sort of like available to us in the finished poem form. And so I might say something like experimental, which will not reduce it very much further, it looks like. Experimental programs, right? Because they do. Um, and then we see that at the end here, there's a bunch of interesting other stuff. Experimental programs, right? Computer. Oh, it's not clicking it. Ah, there we go. Yeah. So experimental programs, right? And then we have two possibilities, it looks like here. One of which, why is my browser so slow? Um, yeah, so we have A, the article A, or we have the, which is going to be kind of like a determiner. And so if I click one of these, oh, interesting, new. It's an adjective actually. Okay, so experimental programs write a new computer is going to be our final poem here. And I kind of like that actually. So we'll go ahead and click on these and just sort of like lock in that as like the thing we produced. Experimental programs write a new computer. And if we want to kind of like unconstrain one of these or two of these, maybe I'll like unclick programs and unclick write. And we start to see other possibilities emerge here. So experimental poems want a new computer, and so on and so forth. And you can kind of probe around in this space of possible ways of extracting basically like one like well-formed sentence, grammatically speaking, from this broad source text to kind of maybe probe at hidden meanings or things that might not be like intended by the original author, but that you want to say instead, or use this as kind of like the raw material to be sort of sculpted or shaped. And so, yeah, people are asking in the chat about the way that this works. That's actually what the next few slides are about. I have a couple other examples of poems that I've written with the system here. The Wikipedia article Elegy, I built a version of this that works as a like a browser extension that just kind of lets you do this to any page that you want. So I did a lot of Wikipedia stuff with it. So Elegy turns into like a mournful poem, describes a strange reflection. Um, and so when we have a sort of sentence like this, we're going to start with like maybe space in science fiction frequently plays the role of the final frontier. What we essentially do is kind of take this initial sentence and multiply it out by a whole bunch of different instances and tag out with a part of speech tagger what roles each of these words might play in sort of a final finished poem. Now, the way that part of speech tagging typically works is it tries to assign like the best tag to each word in the context. What we actually did with this case was like hack the part of speech classifier to just do like any part of speech that each word could individually play in any possible text is like allowed to be a tag for it in the final output. And then yeah, we create a whole bunch of different instances of this intro sentence and start a matcher for each one. And the matcher is looking for a particular kind of pattern. So this one up top is looking for like a sequence of a noun, an adverb, a verb, a determiner, an adjective, and a noun. This next one's looking for like a noun followed by a verb, followed by a determiner, followed by a noun, and so on. And we try to do some sort of like agreement stuff between like, oh, if there's going to be like a noun and a verb, they have to be like in the same tense or whatever. Um, but yeah, we have sort of each matcher first consider like this initial token of this of the word space. Some of them are going to say I want this because it's a noun. Some of them are going to say I don't want this because it's not what I'm looking for. And then the ones that accept kind of move on to the next one. Um, and then we say in. Okay, well, some of them want in, and so on and so forth. Some of them don't. And then we sort of like fast forward this process by stepping over all of the words in this text until the matcher has either matched or rejected by not sort of getting all the things it was looking for. And then we get a bunch of different forms of each match sort of like appearing as a possibility. So like space frequently plays the final frontier, science plays the role, fiction plays the frontier, et cetera, et cetera. This one sort of didn't manage to get all of the things it was looking for, so it failed in the end. We don't actually include that as a possible poem. And then we have like space frequently plays and a whole bunch of others. And then we kind of use that interface to let you sort of like select between or like navigate around the space of different erasures of this poem that you can sort of like play with and sort of like find the one that you want in this vast space of possible erasures. One thing that's interesting about this is we actually did some evaluation of this system where we had a few different people, including me, write a sequence of different poems using the same input text. And we kind of plotted those poems in terms of like a few different metrics that we can use to evaluate them. One thing that we see here is that when you plot them this way, different users, so like the user whose poems are the red dots here, are covering different parts of this expressive range. The white sort of stuff in the background is like a density map or a heat map of how like all of the poems that the system could in theory make from the input text that we gave it to work with. But when you have somebody sort of like navigating the space, they tend to pick out like the red region or like the orange region or like the blue region down here in the bottom right. And individual sort of like users or poets find different directions to go with the poems they're writing. We also see that collectively the poems are pretty diverse. They cover the expressive range quite well. But the poems that people are creating are mostly unusual relative to what the system itself would create unguided. So there's like this sort of center of mass here, where this is like the kind of thing that, given this input text, reductionist would want to sort of make on its own. And then every individual poet is like kind of going in a different direction away from that. They're almost like avoiding the center of mass, which I thought was kind of cool. We see that when you sort of plot these in a sequence, this is like one person doing a sequence of poems over time, with like the lighter ones being earlier and the darker ones being later. We see that they have these interesting trends or trajectories that they follow. So like in this case, someone is moving gradually towards like taking words from later and later in the source text, and toward words that are more unusual relative to the other words that are in there, words that have like a lower frequency in the English corpus. And so this is all kind of like an interesting thing where we see that like by constraining the way of writing, we kind of get away from the typical assumption that like, oh, the machine kind of like homogenizes or pushes everyone towards like the default style, which we see a lot with language model assisted tools in particular. But instead here, because it's a different kind of constraint or a different kind of interface, people end up diverging more widely and sort of like going in more extreme weird directions over time. Another of these interesting erasure experiments that I've been doing, and this is a slightly more recent one, is called save lost. The idea here is that we kind of take an initial input sentence, like what isn't saved will be lost. There's like the title of a game by my friend Kat Manning, kind of about memory and like the weirdness of like reconstructing your memories after you've got like sort of a traumatic event that makes them like all jumbled or weird. Um, and you kind of take this initial input and try every single possible one character deletion of this input until you find the one that has the best semantic similarity, according to a text embedding model to this input sentence. So here what we actually get is the one that sort of removes or erases the meaning of the sentence the least is just deleting that final parenthesis on the end. So we see that as the next sort of edit that we make to this text. We kind of take the one that is like least destructive to the meaning of the original input as far as we can, in the space of like one character deletions. We do this over and over and over again. We sort of get to some interesting interstitial points along the way. So we have like what saved will be lost, save will be lost, save be lost. And then finally, towards the end, we get to save lost, which is sort of the name of the system. So given this input, the system kind of named itself. Um, and this gradual process of sort of like iterative deletion kind of compresses this text down to a smaller and smaller version of itself while trying to preserve the core of the meaning as much as possible. But of course, this is kind of like a hopeless thing, right? It's sort of like an interesting like interactive tragedy to kind of watch it do this, especially because you see that like there's important things that get omitted very early on that if it had that sort of token later on in this deletion process, it would be able to preserve more of the original essence of the text. Here we get this sort of negation of this idea of isn't, what isn't saved will be lost, turning into isn't, and then immediately into is, what is saved will be lost. So it's kind of like lost the idea that there's a negation going on at all. But then it would probably benefit a lot from having that negation towards the end as well to be able to preserve more of the meaning. The problem is that it has no look ahead into the future, so it can't decide to make choices that are like good on the longer time horizon. So I think this is really interesting to kind of like watch this machine try to like reduce this text down to its essence. And so I can also demo this one briefly. Just tapping over to this tab. This is actually this particular interactive version is a collaboration with my friend Barrett Anderson, so it's listed on his site. We can kind of pick a random text from this interesting corpus of things we tried. The old man, the boat is kind of like a standard test sentence in linguistics. It kind of like suggests one direction of meaning and then kind of goes off in another one unexpectedly. And you can see that when we do this deletion process, it first deletes like the T from the, so the old man, he boat, he old man, he boat, he old man, he boat, he old man boat, he old man boat, and then so on and so forth. We get to like he old boat, and then old boat, old oat, old, o, and then it's gone. We can try another one, see what we get this time. Click the button. Oh, our browser's being kind of slow. Yeah, okay. So this one's going to take a little bit longer because it's a longer sentence, so it has to try more deletion candidates at each step. Oh yeah, and so we get the essence of a lossy compression scheme is choosing what matters least to forget. This is just something that I wrote while I was thinking about this machine, and we can see that we're kind of gradually reducing it down, and so on. We get to like the essence of lossy compression scheme, choosing matter to forget. It's interesting that it hasn't deleted this initial "the" at the beginning of the sentence. This is kind of like a quirk of the embeddings model where it sometimes doesn't understand some tokens as being important that are, or sometimes does understand some tokens as being important that aren't. And then I can kind of scroll down as we can kind of follow it, sort of making its way through this text, kind of like chewing on it. And we get to like the loss compression, loss compression, and then loss press, loss losses, loss, os, o, and then gone. Um, so this sort of like interesting poetic character of watching the text be like erased or removed down to nothing is I think kind of interesting and has produced a lot of really interesting stuff in my experience. I did a book pretty recently for NanoGenmo that's called Ream Carving, where we just take a bunch of sentences from Wikipedia that are about like different exhortations to remember, basically. Like remember that blank that just has been like added to the Wikipedia corpus somewhere. And we take like I think 813 of those and like reduce them down using this algorithm to these like sort of gradual erasures. And you can sort of like watch things that someone wanted remembered being forgotten by the computer, which I think is kind of strange. Okay. So yeah, this Save Loss project is one of the ones that I've been playing with a lot recently. This kind of inspired some of my other embeddings work, so we'll get to that in a little bit. But I just like this idea of kind of like erasing things as a form of textual addition that produces interesting outcomes sometimes. Now, this one I'm going to cover much more briefly because I don't have as many cool interactive demos to show right now. But gesture is this idea of like, rather than just specifying writings by writing or by picking out individual words, what if we could instead take other sort of forms of expression and translate them into words using some sort of interesting intermediary? The stuff that I'm mostly patterning this work on was actually originally a collaborator of mine, John Chung's. He did this thing called Tailbrush for his PhD thesis back in 2022. I think this was actually maybe even 2021 he did the work, where language models were kind of this really new concept and no one knew what to do with them quite yet. So he kind of invented this system where you can draw the arc of a story as like a curve. And this kind of is supposed to be the fortunes of the protagonist, the main character of the story. So maybe like if you start low at the beginning, go up to be higher, and then go back down to being lower later on, it'll try to generate a story that kind of follows that arc, with the character starting out kind of down in the dumps, maybe having a gradually improving situation, and then things kind of peak in the middle and get worse again towards the end. Um, and so this is really interesting and fresh feeling sometimes in terms of like the weird language it put together. This helped that the language model was not particularly RLHF'd yet. So it had not been given this strong sense of human writing preferences as much. It had learned how to produce syntactically valid text sequences from the internet, from this really very vast, like large corpus of assorted random text. But it had not yet learned how to know which text would be better from like a random human like A/B tester's perspective, basically. So it was sometimes producing very strange things, and I thought this was kind of like an evocative interaction of like draw the arc and then sort of have text follow that arc. So we actually did a little bit of work on this where we tried to generalize it to different kinds of aspects of the text could be sort of like specified as different curves at the same time. So we built this thing called Patchwork, which is like a big canvas where you can do a lot of different like sort of co-creative writing stuff with machines. And drawing these arcs for like the fortunes of the character Tensha and the fortunes of the character Tilda, and also the seriousness of the narration, and also the Tensha Tilda relationship, like how strongly they like one another or dislike one another, all being specified as these different gestural arcs at the same time, can produce these really interestingly like over-constrained sort of like stories. And you end up with like stories that have to deal with like, oh, Tensha's fortunes are rising over time, but then falling off a little bit at the end. Tilda starts out having a really great time, and then things kind of like crater for her about halfway through. Their relationship is overall being impacted by these things, and then like the narration gets like really serious towards the middle because it's maybe like getting more to be like a thriller or something like that. But then towards the end, it like craters tremendously and becomes like kind of a farce or something like that. And specifying all these different sort of like gestural modes of input to kind of like constrain or steer story generation produces some really strange stuff sometimes. Um, Moving on from this, I worked with John and with one other person, Melissa Romilly, on the construction of the system called Toyteller. I don't know how many people here are familiar with the Heider Simmel experiment, which is basically where you kind of show people a bunch of animations of like little triangles and squares, kind of like bullying one another or like otherwise behaving in these like abstract ways that suggest like social behaviors, basically, and ask them to sort of interpret the story that comes out of that animation. And it's found that people can, with very little information, kind of like generalize like ideas about like the social world of these characters and like their emotional experiences and so on. But here we actually have kind of a data set that Melissa collected during her PhD work back in like 2015, where she had a bunch of people like enact different like little triangle charades, basically, like kind of drag triangles around to like tell a particular kind of story. And then different people kind of watch the triangle charades playing out and try to like describe what's going on with them. That gives us like maybe 1,000 paired examples of like moving little triangles around and like what story that represents textually. Um, And then we kind of built this interface that uses this as sort of like an adapter model to kind of steer story generation, where you've got two different people here, or maybe one person, playing around with these triangles, kind of like moving them around in this physical space, to act out a story between them. So maybe I've got like, oh, here's a character over here, here's another one over here. This one is like chasing this one, and this one's like, oh, I'm gonna fall over and trip. And then this one's like, I'm gonna get you, and then this like runs away. And these sort of physical demonstrations with these toys, these sort of like triangular toys, can then sort of like be used to steer the text of the story that is produced. So we get these interesting superpositions of like if a gesture that you're making looks kind of like flirting and kind of like chasing and kind of like something else, then the system kind of can tell that there's this like weird mixture or semantic ambiguity about how to interpret that gesture textually, and it passes that through to the final text in really strange ways. Um, and we've seen some interesting like output stories from the system that are very like almost alien social rules being enacted in various narrative situations. So we had this example of like there's these characters who are at a party and one of them is like mad at another. And so what they do is they like go up to them and just like stare at them and stare at them and stare at them persistently, until the other person is like embarrassed and forced to leave. And I don't think that's the thing that any humans have ever actually done necessarily. But it was very evocative, and it's like a sort of unusual way of conveying this sort of emotional dynamic between them. So yeah, I think this kind of gestural interaction is very cool in some ways. It gives you like alternative ways of specifying texts that go beyond, like if you were picking the words, you wouldn't think to even say those things. Okay, strategy number three is this mutation thing, where we sort of like explore and apply big transformations to a whole text at once. Um, we had a little bit of work on this in this context of patch view, which is kind of an extension of this patchwork thing, where we let you specify these semantic magnets of like different concepts that are relevant to the text you're trying to write. This is all kind of language model steering stuff right now. So we have like, oh, maybe an axis that goes from like high magic power to low magic power in like a fantasy setting. We cross it over with a different pair of magnets for like strong in physical strength, weak in physical strength. We have like a bunch of little character bios that get sort of like automatically like assigned to semantic placements in this like sort of 2D palette, based on how strong or weak these characters are on these two different dimensions. In parallel, we've got the same character bios matching up with like a different axis here, like the good to evil axis in this sort of like conventional D&D morality kind of sense or whatever. Um, and you can see that these dots are kind of arranged to show you like, oh, well, Vivian is this character who's like more towards the good side and then like more towards the high magic strength, high physical strength side. But if you're generating like a whole cast of characters or writing about a whole different set of like different characters you want to represent, maybe you notice there's like gaps here, where like some of the characters don't fall into this like sort of ambiguous but leaning negative moral category. Or maybe everybody is like strong at both or weak at both magic and physical strength. So you can kind of take one of these and maybe nudge it around, on one of these plots while holding it constant on the others, and get sort of like rewrites that try to move them towards this new semantic location, in terms of these like lenses that you've specified. So maybe taking a character and making them like physically weaker, while retaining all other aspects of maybe like their faction affiliation and like their morality and these other things. Or take a character that is like a protagonist right now and hold them constant on every other axis, but duplicate them and make them evil. And that gives you maybe like a foil or a villain or something to play around with. So I think this is an interesting way of like working with the text, not sort of directly in the sense of like editing words again, but more as sort of like these mutations that are along these different semantic dimensions that you specified. Um, and more recently, with Alex Calderwood as sort of the project lead on this one, we built this thing called Phraselet, which I think of as like a polyvocal phrase thesaurus. This is kind of like a really complicated like airplane cockpit of an interface. On the left-hand side here, we've got this actual text that you're kind of composing. You might start out by pasting in some text that you've written yourself, or like a poem that you want to like riff on or modulate. Um, and then on the right-hand side here, we've got a bunch of what we call inlets. And the inlets here, we kind of like select a range of text. Here we have like glazed width being selected. And there's a bunch of different sort of lenses you can use to make sense of this. And then maybe like suggest phrase alternatives that might go here. So we get stuff that's like glazed width is like we can maybe like constrain. We want to make sure that it has the same parts of speech in the sequence of like verb followed by an adverb phrase or something like that. And then like we have different thesauruses that we're kind of using to like sample alternative phrases based on these constraints we've specified. So here we might be using like Alfred Jerry's inverted dictionary of pataphysics, as like a thing that like tries to modulate this phrase into a different sort of like phrase that follows the same structural template. So like we get alternatives like vulcanized via, vitrified per, encrusted through, et cetera, et cetera. And then these rephrasings that you can sort of watch emerge at the bottom are shown in terms of like their probability according to some like general model of like what words tend to follow what other words in language, but then also whether they sort of adhere to all of the constraints or whether they're only matching some of them. So you get this kind of like fuzzily like radiating outward space of possible rephrasings that retain or lose more of the meaning in different directions as you kind of like go further. Um, and this is a really complicated thing to talk about technically because it does a lot of like constraining of the language model to be like using this beam search process to find like sequences of words that are both syntactically valid according to like classical NLP part of speech tagging stuff, according to like the user is given this option to like kind of manipulate the probability distribution of like how likely they want the next things to be. So maybe picking things that are like only like either very high probability or very low probability, but not in between. Or maybe just like constraining it to be things that are only in the middle of this range to be like kind of spicy, but like not like so spicy that they're out in the nonsense space totally. And then all these different constraints being imposed to sort of like do these rewrites give you kind of like this ranked possibility space of rephrasings of this phrase that you're trying to edit. And then you find some strange stuff sometimes. So we have things that let you do like, oh, the phonics of this word, like captivating me. That can be starts with like and you specify like the phonemes that kind of come at the beginning of one of these completions. And that's one of the constraints you can kind of use. You can like write in your own text for like a reader who's like giving you critical feedback like from this particular persona, and then suggesting phrases that might work better for that like sort of direction of feedback. We can obviously do the part of speech thing, and then all these different combinations give you some interesting stuff. So we were especially playing around with this idea of like the wizard climbed the big old staircase in one of these tests that we were doing. I think this was Alex's original phrasing, and we were trying to convey like the sense of like things being like decaying and old and decrepit and so on. And it gave us, among other things, the phrase mammoth decay trod, which is probably the strangest piece of language I've ever seen come out of a language model. So by imposing tons and tons of constraints on this, we get weird phrases like cyclopean creekful, titanic eldering, elephantine senescent climber, and so on and so forth, that just like push you out into like unusual ways of expressing this idea that is like in some ways quite straightforward, but that you can sort of make feel weird and fresh by sort of like turning it in like sideways directions using this algorithmic constraint sort of process. Okay, so that was strategy number three, and then strategy number four is this one of crossover or like kind of like hybridizing different aspects of text, sort of like crossing them over with one another in different ways. Um, I don't know how many people have seen Blabrex. This is kind of a Scrabble variant that I made. I'll actually go ahead and pop this up really fast. What we have here is basically, actually, I'll go through the slides first. Scrabble is kind of this like game of placing letter tiles for those who aren't familiar with it. And you kind of like draw a bunch of letter tiles from a bag, and then you kind of have to like place them on the board in a sequence that makes a word. And there's like obviously like the English dictionary kind of constrains what words are considered real words in serious Scrabble play. So you're not allowed to play words that are not in the dictionary somewhere. Blabrex is sort of a riff on that, where we refrain from using any real words and actually kind of like taboo anything that's actually in the dictionary. So you can't play something like arbiter, for instance, that's actually in there. But you also can't just play straight up nonsense. So you can't play like zamp, that's not pronounceable, so it's not really a word. Um, Instead, you have to play nonsense words that sound plausible to a model that's been trained on the dictionary. So here we have grankistry as a word that looks pretty good. This one's probably going to go through. And this is sort of looking at basically the syntactic structure of this word in some cases, or possibly like a more sophisticated, like sort of convolutional neural network approach where we look at like the word as a whole and kind of like try to figure out whether it's pronounceable or not. And this is sort of uses the replacement for the dictionary in conventional Scrabble play. Um, and so the Markov chain-based version of this is the first one that I built. This looks at trigrams, basically, like the probability of each like three-character sequence in a word. So for TEOS, this is going to pass because TEO has a certain probability of occurring at the start of a word. EOS has a certain probability of occurring in the middle of a word, and then OSS has a certain probability at the end. You kind of multiply these all together, and then because this is greater than the average probability of all five-letter dictionary words, then this is considered to be like a good English word. versus Zeuben. There's kind of this problematic, like many words do not have oib in them. Oib is a very uncommon trigram in English, according to the dictionary. And so this one kind of like takes the probability of this overall word so low that it now falls below that threshold of being more likely than half of the actual English words of the same length. And so essentially, this is considered to be a fake word and rejected. So a fun side effect of this is that when you play a word using the original Markov classifier in LabRex, that is considered to be like more plausible as a dictionary word than half of all the actual dictionary words that are of the same length. So I think it's kind of fun. Um, Meanwhile, for the classical or for the CNN, the convolutional neural network based classifier, we actually generated, and this was with Isaac Karth, who's another of my collaborators, sort of like a list of real words, obviously from the dictionary, but also a list of fake words that have the same probability of letters being drawn and sort of placed in them as actual English. So we have things like sloy and imi and so on. And so these are kind of used as contrastive negative examples of things that should not be permitted through. It turns out that if you just use pure random draw of all the letters, you end up with the classifier basically learning like a much weaker rule of like just never let anything through that has an X in it or a Q in it or a W in it because those are kind of rare letters individually. And that sort of distinguishes the fake from the real quite easily. So you end up having to use these like real English letter frequencies to kind of make sure your contrastive data is better. Um, but when you have this Scrabble sort of system and these two different classifiers, you can end up with like different classifiers kind of disagreeing about which words are good or bad. So like ample goes through just fine on the Markov classifier, but is rejected by the CNN, for instance. And the two different classifiers have kind of like different quirks or different restrictions that kind of lead them to accept or reject different aspects of English. And so if anyone wants to try anything really fast, I can just pull up the LabRex interface and like someone can put in chat like a thing we should test and see if we can get anything through. Someone did mention that the probability of OIB maybe should be higher. Foible, yeah. So foible is going to be in the dictionary, obviously, but if we do like foibly, that's definitely going to be rejected, I think, because it's like too implausible. Let's try the neural classifier now and see if that one works. So foibly actually gets through on the neural classifier specifically, which has learned like a more abstract sense of like what counts as pronounceable, probably. So we can do like foibly, maybe like the adverbial form of foible. We have a thing here where we're kind of accumulating like definitions if you want to type in things. So like you can just type in like whatever you want that word to mean. Someone suggests witblargen. So that's rejected by the neural classifier and also by the Markov classifier, actually. But then if you sort of mutate it, I do wonder if I do like witty blargon, yeah, that actually gets through. So I have a little bit of a sense for like what things it tends to accept and reject after playing with it for a long time. So yeah, I'll go ahead and submit that one, and then we can sort of move on. Oh, hypergea, yeah, let's try that. Oh yeah, so that one looks good. Um, and so I think this is like sort of interesting adversarial interaction of like having a machine kind of telling you what words are and aren't allowed to be used creates this really like sort of provocative situation sometimes where my frustration with Scrabble was originally born from just really not liking having the dictionary tell me like what is and is not a real word according to like my own felt sense of language. And so I think I was really trying to like parody that here, basically like accentuate that sort of like weird paradox of an external authority claiming to dictate like what words are real and not real in a way that makes it very obvious like what the problem is with Scrabble in my opinion. Yeah, I think it would be fun to do a Blabrex playthrough at some point with people if anyone wants to do that. Okay, but yeah, so the same algorithm, the sort of thing that can kind of classify like whether a word is probable or not according to a certain like sort of predetermined sequence of like this is what the dictionary contains, or this is like how often we think certain letters crop up or whatever. Also enables us to do things like blabreckage. And this is kind of like a nonsense style transfer app that I made, where you can take an initial text, maybe like this classic poem Ozymandias, and sort of procedurally turn it into something much more nonsensical, but still kind of pronounceable in an interesting way. So you recognize like the form of the original text, but without it having any of the sort of actual words in it that sort of make it feel like Ozymandias specifically. Isessa Grabelius pronal unlike non, Zisforus predistance gracklers versus chans and trivivers, Zeswis and trenons, Kalzinga, chensins mickit keys, wisp prawns, et cetera, et cetera. And you find yourself saying this thing that feels like it's got sort of the rhythm of Ozymandias, but sounds like you're speaking Simlish or something like that, like you're talking sort of like a nonsense language. And I find this kind of interesting and compelling in some ways. And then if we go over to LibRecords really fast, like I can grab a different sort of source text and I'll just show what it looks like when it edits really fast. It has this animation where it sort of procedurally like goes through and picks the most important edit that it can make in terms of improving the probability of the overall text from the perspective of the Blabrex model. So it's looking for a bunch of like one character edits it can do, one after another, that gradually turn words into like more probable words according to Blabrex. And so we do something like this is sort of like a snippet of song lyrics that I like. We modulate it, and it turns into something that again has that sort of like initial sort of like flavor. Some of the words end up even being preserved directly because imperial is very hard to edit. It turns out into like a more probable word by the Blabrex model. But again, by trying a bunch of like one character edits and sort of like using this external model of which ones are good, basically, we kind of probe the space of nonsensical alterations of a text to find interesting ones. What's kind of cool about this one, in my opinion, is that it also works the other direction. So if you try like raw random noise, just like summoned from like take all of the 26 characters of the alphabet and like sort of smush them all together, you get things that are totally unpronounceable. Like I don't even know where to go to begin to pronounce this. But if I press this button, that sort of does this periodic like addition thing. It's going to gradually turn it into like, oh yeah, like over a Pririaquis, Quitracanis, keys, and so on and so forth, where like it becomes more pronounceable while maintaining some of that original like nonsense flavor. Um, and the thing that I find most compelling about this as an algorithm is that it lets us do stuff like this. I'm going to read a little bit of this one and then have people guess like where we learned the probabilities from for this particular modulation of Ozymandias. I yet a waviver from an antique man, the gain, the wast and crookless yes of Vyong stand in the navir, read there of the man, call much a waptered livelreed, wist frown, and wingled his, and neen of old command, bell what its ulated kill wist parsh young red, which yet perneve, steaded of their liverous wings, etc., etc. So, does anyone have a guess as to like what source text we might have used to kind of take the Ozymandias structure and like translate it into language of this particular sort of like nonsense flavor? I don't know. Jabberwocky is a possibility. Interesting, interesting. Lord of the Rings, also interesting. What we've actually got here is this is Moby Dick. And so you can start to hear a little bit of that like sort of like almost biblical alluding like nautical language in some of these words. Like you listen, man, the zong and liver man stretch for swass. This does feel to me like something that a particularly nonsensical version of Ahab might be ranting at the ocean at some point as he's like chasing this whale. And so here again, we can kind of like slice off some aspect of one of these source texts, slice off a different aspect of a different source text. In this case, kind of the structure of Ozymandias and the word feel of Moby Dick. And when you kind of cross them over, you get this really weird, interesting, like sort of interstitial. Someone asks, is Moby Dick particularly useful because of its length? I think it is in many ways, and also because the word choices in it are very distinctive. So you end up with like I think a lot more W's in this than you would if you were just using like a generic English corpus, probably, because whales show up a lot in Moby Dick, and so I think that certain letters are actually more prominent in Moby Dick translations of sources than if you were using some other input. Okay, so going back to this overall sort of diagram here, basically what I've been doing with this practice is just kind of probing lots of different spaces of possible text that a machine could produce that are sometimes compelling to me. And the thing that I find really cool about this practice is that when you design a bunch of different machines, as I have done in the past and as I continue to do as I go forward, you end up with like really different overlapping spaces of possible interesting text outputs. So some texts machine or some of these text production machines might produce things that are like in a different part of this compelling text space to me. Some of them might produce things that are maybe interesting to others or that are like overlapping with other tastes, but not with mine. Some of them might even be just like a really strange nonsense machine that like doesn't actually touch on the corpus of stuff that humans find interesting at any rate. But you can still produce like different weird sort of like probes that go out into nonsense space and find interesting stuff and report it back. So I think that a few key takeaways from this sort of thing for me. Number one, when you're a crafter of expressive text, either a poet or a story writer or whatever, sometimes there can be a beneficial complementarity between different interaction modes, including not just like traditional word specification, but also kind of like sculpture or like modification or subtraction. Um, Second, we have this idea of unusual modes of interaction with these same old text processing technologies, either Markov chains, which we think look a certain way, or language models, which we think look a certain way, or whatever, starting to be turned into other things, basically, by the construction of an alternative loop or an alternative interaction mode around that sort of core algorithm. So we can kind of get outside of this homogenized, like normative ground of this sort of like material, this algorithmic material, by using it in unusual ways in this broader text production pipeline. Um, Thirdly, different text production instruments facilitate exploration of different aspects or different corners of semantic space. And so I tend to see this kind of instrument design as either poetic or maybe even like meta-poetic craft. What you do when you make a machine for producing weird texts is a kind of poetry or meta-poetry, where you're selecting out like a subspace of language that might be cool or interesting or compelling, and like sort of pointing people at it. And then, of course, this design space of text sculpting instruments is really wide open, and I want to explore it more. So I think it would be really cool to see other people sort of like just building more of these like weird text machines to kind of go to strange places in semantic space. So yeah, a bunch of this stuff is covered in publications of mine. They're on my website. I think what we should do is probably take questions now and do some discussion, and then if there's time afterwards, we can do a little bit of like live coding with this like browser text embedding sort of repo starter kit thing, where we try to like maybe make a save lost like or something that's similar to it, kind of playing around with this embedding model of semantic similarity as like a material for doing weird poetry stuff. But yeah, I think we should do questions first.
Cool. Thank you, Max. First, can we do like a round of like snaps, claps, whatever emoji best expresses your thoughts and feelings now? Um, yeah, thank you. This was really, really lovely. And I know that there are some questions in the chat, and I'll try to find those. But if anyone has something that's coming top of mind, please feel free to like either share it in the chat and I'll be happy to read, or go ahead and unmute. Vohini, I see you have a question in the chat. Do you want me to read it, or do you want to talk through it yourself?
Oh, yeah, I can say it.
Yeah,
Um,
amazing.
I am personally always sort of like thinking about how to think through the aesthetics and the politics of using stuff like the stuff you've shown us, built by individuals, built by communities, versus corporate products like the ones from OpenAI or Anthropic or whoever.
Mhm.
And given like that you've kind of been in all these different worlds, curious about, or and even just given your background as a poet too, what are your thoughts on all this?
Yeah, totally. One of the reasons that I'm not in industry doing Gen AI industry stuff right now is because I'm not super thrilled about the way that the model production processes basically are like enclosing the commons, right? You kind of like take a bunch of stuff from the open internet and like sort of train on it in this very secretive process, produce kind of like a black box thing that is not sort of shared openly or freely, but is instead like sort of used as a thing to charge rent on. And then that's sort of like your contribution back to the commons. That doesn't strike me as particularly like fair or equitable. And so like I think it's sometimes like a necessary evil in the sense of like you don't necessarily get a language model without a bunch of people deciding to do that unilaterally in the first place. But I also do think that stuff that comes from the commons should have to probably be given back to the commons as a free resource again. So in my opinion, the companies that are doing language model training and contributing them back as open weights things tend to be more compatible with my ethics and my values than the ones that are doing like the full on just sell it back as a commercial service kind of approach. That said, I also think that community ownership is like really the gold standard here. And so someone is mentioning Katie Jira's recent work on this sort of like workshops with like sort of writers. And yeah, Carly is also involved in this. Alicia Guo is also involved in this around like community data governance and data stewardship. So trying to see if you can come up with like what would a model of text, for instance, like a language model by and for creative writers look like? Is I think kind of the top line. I don't want to talk too much about the stuff that Carly knows more about than I do. But this is like a thing I'm very excited about is like sort of an initiative to create models that feel better to work with as material, basically, because the texts that are in them that are sort of like being riffed on are being voluntarily contributed, and the benefits are accruing back to the community rather than to like a small number of centralized like stakeholders.
Yeah, that was a beautiful summary of that. Thank you, Max, for the shout out there. Yeah, it's something that Katie and Alicia and I have been working on for a while, and we're in the very early stages of this. And yeah, Max's summary was excellent and more concise than mine will ever be. But if then people will continue to know about it as things progress for sure. Other questions for max before live coding? I think we'll probably run till about 2:30, right?
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
so.
cool. Yeah, Amanda, go ahead.
Hey Max, thank you so much for bringing to like showing so many different projects in one talk. It's a lot to think about. I'm particularly curious about um, I guess like the word space and for the blackout poetry generator when you showed the heat maps of how people composed their poems. Did you did you look at what their search behavior was like and or question their perceptual experience of like what they were aiming at, and, especially since your area of interest is in like creativity supported tools? Like,
Mhm.
I don't know if you had any like qualitative responses from those who played with it about whether or not it like encouraged them to do more things or what their intentions were as they were using the tool. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. So this work was actually initially done with me and the other three authors of the paper that this like evaluation technique was introduced in, basically. And so the trajectories that you see here, I think this one is probably either me or my advisor, Michael. Um, and we were able to talk to the people who were doing it directly because they were all known to us and sort of like participating in the authoring of the paper. Um, I think the technique of doing this kind of like trace analysis here, where you kind of like look at the dynamics of like moving around in that space, were very, very preliminary at that time. So we were like just introducing this idea of like visualizing the trajectories, and like we didn't know what semantic dimensions made sense to analyze for these like two-dimensional slices of the range. And in general, like it was still kind of a novel idea at that point. More recently, this has actually been like a major focus of my like professional human-computer interaction research. So we have this thing called fuzzy linkography we've been doing, where we kind of like look at influence dynamics between different human or machine actors in kind of like a co-creative production process. And then we can kind of like look at like is the human or the machine leading or following? When there's multiple humans working together, like which ideas are getting like incorporated later on in the process versus which ones are not. And then we're starting to like show those diagrams that get generated reflectively to people working with our tools or systems to kind of stimulate their reflection or their thinking about like what was going on in their heads at certain moments during that creative process. So you can see when they're kind of going divergent versus convergent. You can see when the machine is kind of like leading if they're using like a language model or something. You can see when maybe like the human ideas are getting kind of like crowded out of the process. If there's like a group dynamic, you can see someone like taking over or like sort of like becoming more central to the overall dynamics of ideation. And then all of these things become like a material you can like reflect back to the people who are involved in that situation to have them like sort of talk through or think through like how they felt in those moments or like what changed from like one regime of this diagram to another. Um, so we're also running this workshop at Kai this year on the dynamics of creative activity traces, which is basically like the sequences of stuff we can observe about someone doing some kind of like composition task or whatever. And I hope to see a lot of different perspectives on like what you can do with that represented there. We were just soliciting position papers, and I think we have like maybe on the order of like a dozen or so that have been submitted. So hopefully that will also be a good discussion that kind of helps us map out this broad design space of different like trace analysis techniques. Some of which are going to be, I think, crossing over like subjective stuff where we have people like talk about their own process and think through it with these more like visualization based or quantitative approaches that kind of let us like see the dynamics in real time.
Great. Thank you so much. I have so many questions, but I'll wait to read what comes out and send you a note otherwise. Thanks.
Awesome.
Anybody else? Emily, I know Emily had a question about stop words. I can't remember for what tool it was.
Mm.
Maybe was it Blabrex or was it the tool or the toy teller? I think it was the toy teller one.
Oh yeah, stop words. I think in general, when you're using one of these embedding type models to do analysis or modification of texts, stop words do tend to be less important. There's this thing, I don't remember the exact name of the bias, but there's a general bias in sentence embedding models in particular toward like nouns being the most important thing, I think, in terms of like determining semantic similarity between two phrases or whatever. And then I think it's like verbs followed by adjectives or something like that. So things like the tend to just be like not super, super significant in terms of like the computational assessment of like what the meaning of the text actually is. Um, I think it's also interesting that there's different ideas of like what semantic similarity means that apply in different contexts, I think. And an embedding model that's kind of trained for like general purpose retrieval, which is what they mostly are trained for in practice, tends to embed like a lot of assumptions about like what matters about a text. And it's sort of focused mostly on like content and on like these keywords that have like sort of more vivid or concrete or tangible meanings typically. Whereas things like things like a, like other kinds of stop words like that, have less of an impact on the like a sort of essential meaning for like a semantic search sort of application where you're like maybe like tapping in like here's a phrase that I want to find in my photo library, and it finds you like instances of apple or instances of dog or whatever. Um, but I think you could also train an embedding model on a data set that's intended to be about syntax. Alison Parrish did this really cool work a long time ago, like really, really prescient stuff on a phonetic embedding model, where you can basically take a word and turn it into like an embedding of how it sounds when it's pronounced, and was able to do some really cool poetry on that premise, including compasses in particular, which is kind of like she takes like pairs of words that are related or quadrants of words that are related, like north, south, east, west, and interpolates phonetically between them along all these different axes. So you get like nerth and like sorth and those kinds of things. And I think alternative forms of embedding or alternative forms of similarity that take like stop words into greater account, for instance, would be really interesting from a poetics perspective. So I'm hoping to actually build like a toolkit that lets people easily train their own embeddings models, and then like hopefully you can use that in these same kinds of pipelines, but to do different kinds of like poetic effects.
Cool. That's super cool, Max. Questions from anyone else? Or maybe we can now move on to the live coding bit of things. And if you have questions, as you think of questions, just feel free to drop them in the chat too.
Cool. Yeah, so I think this is not going to be super, super in depth because we don't have a ton of time for it. But I'm going to just kind of pull up this browser embeddings demo repository that's on my GitHub. And I'll sort of send a bunch of links to everything that we talked about here afterwards as well. I think I have like a summary document already because I've given a similar version of this workshop elsewhere. Yeah, we can sort of like play around with this and sort of test out basically like different strategies for using embeddings to do poetry stuff. Um, I have already sort of like a hosted version of what you should see when you download this repo and start playing with it here. The cool thing about this is that because we've got this model of textual semantic similarity, and you can just kind of like do comparisons between short text strings, there's like a basically like a one-liner sort of thing you can do here where you embed these two different text strings. Embeddings are sort of these vectors that represent like the positioning of that string in a very large semantic space. It's very high dimensional. And so it's kind of like a list of numbers that sort of indicate like the coordinates of that string in semantic space. And then we embed these two different strings and we do like a cosine similarity, which is kind of like a mathematical operation that tells you how similar two vectors are to one another between them. And that gives you a score, which typically varies between like 0 and 1, that tells you like how similar these strings actually are. And this model is relatively simple. So you can actually run it entirely in the web browser. And that's what's going on here. And in some of the other projects I've done, like Save Lost, where we're doing all of those string comparisons entirely in local JavaScript in your web browser, without having to have the server do any of like the machine learning stuff. So I think this is kind of a cool contrast in some ways with the idea of like the language model in particular is this really big scary apparatus that sits on some server somewhere and you have to like send queries to it over the wire and they come back. And then like you have a hard time gauging what's going on inside that black box. The embeddings models are, I think, surprisingly good at this kind of interpretive stuff of like telling you how similar two texts are. And then you can build much more complicated apparatus around them to do really interesting stuff, without having to like sort of rely on someone else's machine or some really beefy computer to do the inference process of like figuring out what the value of a particular text string like is when you try to find the next token in it or whatever. Um, so yeah. Yeah, Carly's linked the repo in the comments if anyone wants to sort of like just clone that on follow on Git and follow along. And I'll just sort of do some probing for the moment on like so we have this sort of like default interface that I built where you can just tap into strings and see like how similar they are. So we do like cat and dog, and we get like, oh, that's like 0.658 or something like that. So like moderately similar, but not super similar. If we do cat and like kitten, You can see that it gets more similar. If we do cat and like cat with two exclamation points, that's actually slightly less similar, which is interesting. So here we see that like the embeddings models are kind of quirky. They often have things where like, oh, these exclamation points are being treated as like very semantically impactful on the order of this short string, because like it just sort of suggests a different tone maybe, or like is linked to different kinds of source documents in the way that this has been trained. Um, but then if we do things that are more complicated, like let's do like I met a traveler from an antique land versus like I yet a waver from an antique land. Um, and you can see that that's actually quite low similarity, even though they're syntactically quite similar. Like a lot of the individual letters are the same or in similar placements. But the nonsense version of this that's been sort of like blab wreckaged is quite different from this original sort of expression of the poem. And so yeah, someone mentioned Semantic here as a cool example of like a game you can make with this as a sort of premise. Maybe we can just actually go and poke at some of those examples a little bit as well. Semantic here is a kind of like a daily guessing game similar to Wordle. And you kind of try to pick like what the word is. Um, and it gives you a distance score of like how close you are to the thing that's being that's like the sort of the target of this operation basically. So if I do like dog really fast and guess it, we see that that's pretty cold. So like very low proximity to the thing that we're trying to get. Um, if I do like weather, then it's actually colder. It's I think even worse. Um, and then if I do like activate like a verb, um, yeah, activates even further. So all of these are quite out there. And this game takes forever to play in my experience. It's like quite painful in a lot of ways. Because figuring out how to get towards a thing when all you have is like feedback about how far you are from that thing in semantic space, which is like super high dimensional and vast, is actually like quite difficult. Um, when I ran a previous version of this talk slash workshop with a little bit more hands-on programming involved, someone made a battleship game that's kind of like Semantle, but is more about like if you're close enough, like if you're in the neighborhood of the text that you're trying to hit, then that counts as a hit on that sort of like target. And there's like a bunch of different targets that are like adjacent to one another in semantic space. And so I think like there's a lot of cool interactions you can build around kind of using these different word entries or different sentence entries as like probes and seeing how close they are to some sort of input or some sort of like corpus of things that have been set up. So this kind of like targeting game is one thing you can build as an interaction around this kind of embedding model. Um, We've also got, I did this thing called Whale Quest. This is more of an offline thing, so it doesn't have like a cool interactive interface. But we took the whole text of Moby Dick and we sorted every sentence in it by how close it is, how similar it is to the word whale. And then put the least whaley stuff at the beginning and the most whaley stuff at the end. So you can kind of read from the beginning, which ends up as this like pile of mostly stage directions, like enter Ahab, then all, book one, folio, chapter four, sulky and sleepy. Ahab goes, Pip steps one step forward, aside, quietly smoking, etc. So it's like clustered all of this towards the beginning because it's all very, very far from the idea of a whale. Um, we get things that are kind of clustered together as we go further. Like this, here's all the sailors that show up as like cast character in the cast of characters. Nantucket sailor, Maltese sailor, Sicilian sailor, Azor sailor, Lascar sailor, etc. Um, at some point, it gets to the point of like, oh, like because the string O with an exclamation point appears as its own sort of like independent sentence many times in this text, they're all exactly the same distance from whale. And so they all end up occurring right next to one another. So you've got like this strand of narration that's ending up being broken up by like just many, many instances of oh. And it's sort of like this strange moment of the narrator getting like really perplexed and having to catch their wits for a moment. Um, we get some cool juxtapositions like this world pays dividends. No, no, only black water. And then things get a little whaley pretty early on. You see that there starts to be things like, oh, the Finny people's king, as with whalemen, and like the whale referred to, et cetera, et cetera. But this is all still towards the beginning of the text. And it's mostly at the very end that the string whales start showing up over and over and over again. So you get to like the mighty whales which swim in a sea of water and have a sea of oil swimming in them, humpback. This whale is often seen on the Northern American coast. Did you ever strike a fish? It was the whiteness of the whale that above all things appalled me. But that pipe poor whale was thy last. And so it starts feeling as though you are a little bit like Ahab getting kind of driven to madness as you get closer to this objective of like this whale quest. And then at the very end, I'm not going to spoil it, but like there's kind of this cool like shift in the diction, and like the last line ends up being a really good punchline, I think, for this joke of like the quest for the whale in semantic space. So this is kind of another thing where just having this embedding similarity model allows you to kind of sort a text according to like how similar all the things in it are to some target, and then like sort of that reordering gives you this like interesting experiential arc of like progress towards a goal or progress towards a destination, which you can then obviously imagine like using in other ways. For instance, if you wanted to like take here's a source text that we're taking like the one sentence to the next similarities as the score values, and then like taking those exact same score values but trying to find pairs of sentences from a different corpus, that when you put them together, they're pretty close to that in terms of like semantic distance traversed. So you could imagine taking like a text that jumps around a lot, interestingly, and imposing its sort of like semantic navigation structure on a different corpus, and doing something blab-reca-g, but with like the structure being taken from an embedding sequence thing. Um, did I have another example here that I think is good? Oh, the other one that I did was play what I mean. Um, the idea here is that if you've got like a simulation engine like Dwarf Fortress or something, and it's sort of like suggesting a bunch of actions that your characters can do, I guess I should just pull up the actual live demo. Close that. Okay, so we built this sort of like miniature role play scenario where there's like sort of a band that's going into a bar. You're also arriving at this bar at the same time, and you can kind of like walk around and do different stuff in like an open-ended sense. But if I do like, I don't know why it's populating a bunch of names there. I'll say like go in. And so to just like go to entrance as being the most salient action out of the ones that the simulation can actually do. I take my turn. A bunch of other characters are sort of like also entering the building. Isaac, the bartender, is cleaning a glass. The singer goes to the entrance, and there's a bunch of other people inside the bar now. I want to get drunk. And so it's just going to the bar area, or then maybe to the jukebox corner is sort of a fallback. So let's go to the bar. Give me something autumnal. So I mistyped autumnal, but like cider comes up as one of the possible options here, which I think is kind of cute. So we'll order one of those, and so on and so forth. So basically allowing the open-ended text input that the player is doing to be mapped onto a bunch of like concrete simulation actions based on which ones are sort of like similar in semantic space. And then like let's say I want to play some music. And so it's just going to the jukebox corner or the stage area or something like that. And so this is sort of another thing you can kind of do is if you've got like a space of structured actions or structured possibilities that you want people to be given like a way to navigate by typing open-ended text, then sort of like using that open-ended text as like an input to kind of like probe semantic similarity with a bunch of different options, then gives you the option of like surfacing to the front of that list the ones that seem most salient or possibly least salient as well. Um, so again, yeah, a lot of weird interactions you can build around these models. It takes sometimes a little bit of weird thinking, like from different perspectives about like what you can do with a similarity score, in order to like make interesting like textual outcomes happen. But I think this is kind of like a cool underexplored area of design space. Um, Yeah, I see some other questions. So maybe I'll just like maybe we can just do some discussion for the last few minutes here, and I can sort of reply to a few of those. Someone mentions on the topic of how LLMs are made and shared. I've been keeping an eye on the Allen AI Institute at the University of Washington, and yeah, they're focused on the open training data and open source and open training methods, and specifically with this like sort of like tracing things back approach called Olmo trace. And this is something that I find really cool, where you can sort of see in language model output. Let's see if the demo is actually running right now. Like which source texts from the input corpus, the training corpus, are most directly like influencing or leading to the text generation that you're seeing right now. Um, so I think this is just a chat interface, unfortunately. I don't think there's an easy way to access the lens thingy that lets you see the which source documents are sort of like most similar to what you're currently looking at. Um, but in terms of like attribution, I think that kind of thing is very compelling. And because that is like an open training corpus, where you can see everything that went into the language model, it feels very different to me than when you're working with like a ChatGPT or a Claude or something like that. And it's hard to tell like where it's getting the ideas that it's sort of putting into the text that it's completing for you. It feels much more like sort of like a weird mediated interaction with a bunch of individual human authors who all sort of like contributed documents to the training corpus, as opposed to a thing where like there's a weird little guy in the machine that I'm talking to directly. Um, let's see. Someone also mentions the Dwarf Fortress call out and then links to this paper. Oh yeah, the generative agents thing. I know some of the people who worked on this one actually. The idea here is that you've got a whole bunch of little simulated characters walking around like a 2D pixel grid world that looks kind of like Stardew Valley or something. And they're all sort of like thinking through by sort of like generating language what they ought to do next and like what their plans are and what their memories are and like kind of having weird little social interactions in the course of this. So you can see that like there's all these different little corners of the world where like John and Tom are having a conversation about the upcoming mayoral election, and then like Klaus and Abigail are talking about getting coffee at a cafe, and then different characters are like going to like different parts of their routines, so like going to their job or like taking a walk in the park or going to school or those kinds of things. Um, and so yeah, like this kind of cool simulation engine stuff is I think another interesting like gamey direction to go with a lot of this technology. I haven't seen anything that's like a really, really compelling like simulation-based play experience on the basis of either language models or anything similar to them yet. But there's probably something to be done there. And I'm kind of scrolling through chat comments to see if there's anything else. Yeah. So I guess I'll just very briefly pop back to like, here's a little bit of stuff you can do to tinker with embeddings models. Um, I think I'll close out of these tabs really fast, and then switch over to sharing my overall desktop environment. Um, Cool. Okay. Um, and so like playing with this thing here, you can see that you've got these two different strings and we can just sort of compare the similarity. The thing that's really cool about this, in my opinion, is that the code is quite small. So popping over to the text editor really fast, you can see that this whole project basically consists of three files. You've got app.js, which is just like sort of the JavaScript source of this whole thing. And what we're doing at the top here is kind of importing this particular pre-trained embedding model. Called Zenova All Mini LM L6v2. And there's a whole bunch of these that are kind of like open weights models that have been distributed as part of the standard like transformers.js toolkit. Um, and so we kind of import that one and then have this like little utility function that kind of does the extraction of a vector embedding, like sort of a sequence of numbers, using this model from an input source text, and then just kind of returns the list of those numbers. Then we've got things for doing like the dot product, the magnitude, and the cosine similarity between these vectors, which are just very basic, sort of like mathematical, like working with vector operations. And the cosine similarity ends up being the thing that like really matters here of being able to get the direct similarity between two different input sources. Um, and then the entire rest of it is literally just like we've got an input text field number one, input text field number two. You've got a compare button, you've got a score output. And then what we do here is like just get the values of each input when someone presses the compare button, embed them both using that embedding model, and then do the cosine similarity and sort of like put that back in the output. So this is like literally 50 lines of JavaScript, quite simple. And then you can do a whole bunch of different modifications of this to produce like weird alternative poetry machines. One thing you might be able to do if you want to sort of like, let's go ahead and grab a source text from maybe this let's grab it from Black Edge because I think Ozymandias is there and that's a good one to work with. Um, I'll just directly copy paste all of this, um, put it in our text editor, um, const Ozzy equals, and then drop it all in there. Um, And then maybe, yeah, so let's go ahead and when I hit the compare button, instead of putting in the score output, the similarity score between the two input values, let's do like const Aussie lines equals Aussie dot split on the new line character. So we'll get like each individual line of that poem. Let's do like sorted equals, oh, actually, I think JavaScript sort is like it's in place. So we'll do like Aussie lines dot sort. So it's going to take, I think, a pair of inputs A and B, and then we're going to yield. Oh, this has to be an async function because we're going to do awaits of these two different embeddings. This can sort of be an operation that theoretically takes a while, so it's sort of an asynchronous one. Um, we'll do, I'll just copy paste this stuff directly from here, delete it up here. We don't actually need all the input stuff. And then the score will again be the cosine similarity of embedding one and embedding two. Or actually, no, hang on. What do we want to do? We want to sort these by their similarity to like some target, maybe. So let's say whale is our target, sort of arbitrarily. And so we'll say like const whale emb equals await embed, and then the string whale. And then we've got Aussie lines, and we sort them by first embedding the line itself. So we'll embed A, we'll embed B, and then we'll do const score equals. Actually, I think what we'll do is we'll return cosine similarity of M1 whale emb minus cosine similarity of M2 comma whale emb. And so what we get here is sort of a number that represents the difference in the similarity scores between these two different lines and the embedding of the string whale. And so it's going to sort by either getting closer to or getting further from whale, depending on which way the JavaScript sort operation goes by default, which I actually forget. And then for score output.inner text, we'll just say Aussie lines. And let's go ahead and see what this does when I run it directly. I'll do Python 3-m http.server and then port like 6060. And this just starts like a local web server in this repository, so that when I go in my web browser to localhost colon 6060, it'll be like a running version of this thing. And then I'll just hit the compare button really fast and we'll see if anything happens or breaks. Ah, yeah, so here we go. It has in fact sorted Ozymandias by similarity to whale. And it looks like something has gone wrong. So the sort did not take place. It's just concatenating all lines of Ozymandias with one another directly. So I think I'm probably not going to be able to unsnarl this in the time that we've got left. But one of the cool things you can do with this, obviously, is like sort of sort the text by like how close each string is to that sort of semantic target. And in general, I think having this sort of like really quick, like sort of simple minimal rig or framework for just like playing around with these models in the browser gives you this really fast iteration loop where you can try lots of different things, see which ones seem promising, which ones don't, and build lots of cool new interactions around this technology that's like a little bit quirky, but certainly fun to work with and lets you do things like save loss and whale quest. These are the things that I've built. So yeah, not a ton of time left, but if anyone has any last questions, I guess, or last thoughts, we can do that now.
I think you've just given us like a lot to play with, a lot to think with. So I think this has been really, really great. So if we can do another round of like gratitude, appreciation for Max and their work and the time uh they took to show us all of the ways that they're kind of expanding the boundaries of like what is possible with computational systems and language. I really I saw I think part of this talk last year and you were using the like your sort of like Venn diagram kind of explainer and like that's a graphic that's like really stuck with me over the last like 8 or 9 months and I like constantly think about like okay, where am I now and like where do I want to be and like how am I situating myself there? So like thank you for that. Like even just sort of as a simple way of thinking about like what's the relationship with language that you want to cultivate, the relationship with your tools. It's been really like meaningful to me. So I'm grateful.
Awesome.
Um,
Yeah, thanks y'all for the really good questions too. I think it was a really fun discussion.
yeah, totally. Yeah, so thank you, Max. Business for next time. Oh, Cool Deep raised her hand.
Yeah, I want to thank you very much for the browser embeddings demo. I really
Mhm.
enjoyed that. Thank
Cool.
you.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. And good to see you, Cool Deep.
Good to see you.
Uh, yeah, so we're at 2:30. Really grateful for those of y'all who've hung around with us. And the recording of this will be up on the archive like momentarily. I'll get it up right after this. And the March session will be with Margot Machado. So that one should be a lot of fun. I think she'll be doing a lot of work that bridges analog and digital, and there may or may not be like some sort of mail component in the mix there, like literal physical analog mail. So that's what we're up to next. In the meantime, I hope everyone's staying like safe, warm, doing well, all things considered. And like thanks for being here. And we'll see you in March, hopefully. All right. Take care, y'all.
All
Awesome.
right, thank
See
you.
y'all.
Thank you.